Good evening. This is Stephanie Morissette, Reference and Local History Assistant at the Crawfordsville District Public Library. I'm doing a sound check here before we get started. Make sure I've got my tech specs working properly. We've got a few minutes to go yet. For those of you on early tonight, I want to thank you for joining us. We hope to offer another good nature program this evening. Sandhill Cranes are one of my favorite birds, so I'm excited and looking forward to talking about them this evening. Doing a visual check right now. Working out the tech specs. In Sandhill Cranes this evening. Just a few more minutes and we'll get started. Hopefully we'll get started here on time and we will be good to go. We're on the countdown now, 3 minutes. Few minutes and counting down to Sandhill Cranes, brought to you this evening by Crawfordsville District Public Library. I'm Stephanie Morissette and I'll be your host for this evening. Final sound checks happening here. Final sound checks. All right, it's 6 o'clock. Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation on Sandhill Cranes. My name is Stephanie Morissette, and it is my pleasure to bring this program to you tonight on behalf of the Crawfordsville District Public Library. Tonight, we will be talking about what a sandhill crane is, some of their characteristics. We're going to learn about their life cycle. We're also going to talk a little bit about different subspecies of cranes and some relatives of the sandhill crane. We're going to talk about their life cycle when they mate, the social groups that they form, and the different types of communication that they have. With that, we will go ahead and get started. The sandhill crane, or the greater sandhill crane, I should say, Gru canadensis, is the largest subspecies of crane. And we will mention about 6 of those here in just a few minutes. But this crane stands about 3.5 feet tall with a wingspan of up to 7 feet. Now, the sandhill crane weighs between 10 to 14 pounds, and I would like to put that in perspective with another type of bird, the bald eagle. Female bald eagles, on average, weigh between 10 and 14 pounds. So just it's a kind of size and weight comparison between the two different species of birds that I thought was very interesting, because the sandhill crane is rather large and an eagle seems to be much smaller than that. The average lifespan of a sandhill crane is 20 years in the wild. However, if a crane were to be in captivity for an injury that would not allow it to survive on its own in the wild, then the crane would be kept for educational purposes, similar to this one, to let the public know about the species and why it is a particularly important migratory water bird. The sandhill cranes can fly up to 50 miles an hour, and that's given the appropriate wind speed and direction. On average, they typically fly between 20 to 30 miles an hour. The reason not only is the wind important to the sandhill crane for the speed and direction in which they need and want to go, but the wind is even more important in the sense that these birds actually use rising columns of air, warm air, or thermals. They're also called updrafts, and this can take them as high in the sky as 12,000 feet. I know that I've actually watched them over my house and seen them circle upward and upward until they catch that warm air, and then they're off again. The oldest unequivocal sandhill crane fossil, was found about 10 million years ago. Now, this is information that I took from the National Fish and Wildlife Service. So I was extremely interested to find out that the oldest unequivocal, non-disputed fossil of a sandhill crane was that old. These birds, when they were in the time period and still living, were approximately 7 feet tall. That's within the range of an ostrich, so you have a little bit of a size comparison there, perhaps even a little larger. The greater sandhill, is the world's most abundant crane species, and they do migrate in very large numbers. The statistic that I have here on the lower part of the screen was from 2 months ago, well, actually 3 months ago now, taken in January, of an estimated 14,000 sandhill cranes that were stopping over at the Jasper-Pulaski Fish and Wildlife Area, which is in northern Indiana. It straddles both those counties. So the Indiana Department of Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Division actually are the ones who care for this property and maintain it. And it's a great place to go and view cranes. They have a viewing platform and like large binoculars that you can see the cranes close up. Here are some of the subspecies of cranes we're going to mention. The ones at the top of the slide here, the greater sandhill crane, the lesser sandhill crane, and the Canadian sandhill crane, all three are migratory species. However, the greater sandhill crane is the one that has the challenge of a longer migration, whereas the other two, the lesser sandhill and the Canadian sandhill cranes, both have more or less what's called a localized migration, where they don't really migrate very far from their summer grounds, their breeding grounds. The three lower species in red, the Cuban, Florida, and Mississippi sandhill cranes, are all state endangered or threatened in their areas. And the reason for this is that they're isolated populations that have a restricted or limited range in which they live. And so those species are non-migratory and stay confined to a smaller local population in their area. Relatives of sandhill cranes that we have here around in Indiana include the great blue heron. If you are familiar with that image, you see in the upper left-hand image the tall gray bird with the long orange bill and the black stripe on the cap of the head. That is the great blue heron. They're very common along waterways here in Indiana. Next to that, in the upper right, we have the little green heron. I see these guys occasionally, but not as often as the great blue heron. In the lower left-hand image is the egret. These birds are regal in flight. They're so slow and languid and beautiful that they can almost be mistaken for a butterfly, for lack of a better word, a white butterfly, uh, way up in the sky, just beautiful. But I digress. In the central lower image, we have the bittern. And then finally, in the lower right-hand image, we have the whooping crane, which is also native to North America. I did not know that until I started researching for this program. Sandhill cranes do have predators. Uh, the ones that we most commonly might think of would be mammalian predators like foxes and coyotes, even bobcats, but bobcats are becoming fewer and farther between here in our state. There are also avian predators such as the great horned owl or the bald eagle. But the sandhill cranes aren't completely defenseless. They have some defensive maneuvers that they will utilize in the event that they become necessary. If they are being attacked by an avian predator, such as the great horned owl or the bald eagle, they will fly upwards at the predator and kick with their feet. Whereas if they were being attacked by a mammalian predator, like say our fox or coyote, they will run at the predator with its wings open and its bill pointed towards the predator. It's been known that these birds have actually fought their predators and pierced the skulls of these predators. And so that shows you that they are able to fend for themselves when they can. Other threats to sandhill cranes, the number one thing is habitat loss. Since these are a migratory type of waterfowl, wetlands and marshes and bogs, swampy areas, these are particularly important environments that are critical to the sandhill crane's habitat. And habitat loss is mostly occurring due to human development, both commercial and residential. Uh, with this encroachment along the habitats of the sandhill crane, it's becoming increasingly clear that a large area throughout Nebraska along the Platte River, which runs directly across the state, if you look in the lower image, you can see the shape of Nebraska and the waterway that goes straight through it. That's the Platte River. And the whole area highlighted in yellow there is what's considered a critical staging area for the sandhill cranes. They gather here in extremely large numbers during both the spring and fall migration. There are also smaller stopovers along the way, which we've mentioned here in Indiana. We mentioned a couple different ones. They're more of what you could say are minor staging grounds where they come to roost of an evening and leave early of a morning to forage and then come back of an evening together again. Along the Platte River in Nebraska, 80% of the sandhill crane population that we have that migrates from part of the upper Midwest and then down come through Nebraska. So 80% of the sandhill crane population that moves down through Nebraska to overwinter in Texas utilizes this critical area. So human development and habitat loss could be particularly important there at some point in the future. The sandhill crane used to have unregulated hunting, and because their numbers were so large, especially early in the 1900s, there was a lot of unregulated hunting. And there were other migratory waterfowl that were becoming potentially concerning as their populations began to decrease. And so in 1916, the federal government offered protection to migratory waterfowl under the 1916 Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So this gave more protection to the sandhill cranes as well as other migratory birds, um, so that if anyone were to harvest a sandhill crane, they needed to have the proper permits in order to do so. The sandhill crane is omnivorous, which means that they'll eat pretty much anything. In Indiana, they really like when they stop over here in the fall, right after harvest, or on their return in the spring, they can find what we call crop residue, which is basically just your leftover seeds or corn, soybeans, things of that nature that have not been harvested or weren't harvested because of just the loss of that little bit of crop as it happens. But they also eat a lot of different variety of bugs. They'll eat snails and frogs and toads for sure. But how they do that is they stand in the water and they probe their bill into the shallow waters and snatch their food and swallow it whole. Seasonally, sandhills are in different locations. We already talked about they pass through Indiana. And like I said, ours come from the upper Midwest. So we're talking Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and then they migrate down through Indiana. And mostly our cranes go to Florida, which is where their overwintering grounds are. In southern Indiana, we already talked about Jasper Pulaski in northern Indiana, but there is a national wildlife refuge in southern Indiana called Muscatatuck, and that's another stopover here in our state. But there are numerous stopovers in the state of Indiana that can be utilized by the Sandhill Cranes, just not in the numbers that you would see at the two locations that we've discussed. Peak fall migration happens in late September through mid-December, and this is, of course, weather dependent. And that's the same for the spring migration. It's weather dependent, and uh, sandhill cranes can start coming back as early as January, which is what we've seen here in Indiana this year. They can continue migrating up through April. And sometimes you can see just so many cranes at once, it's hard to believe. This map here is just a little larger image of migratory routes that the sandhill cranes take down through our state. The other two arrows, the orange and yellow arrows that are from Nebraska down to Texas and then over to Florida. The best time to observe sandhill cranes is either early of a morning or early of an evening. So dawn and dusk, basically, when the cranes will be coming back to their roosting areas for the evening and stay in numbers for safety. And then when they wake up, they also do the same thing and forage again, come back of an evening. Sandhill cranes form important social networks. These birds are seldom found as a single bird. They're usually encountered in pairs or in family groups. Sometimes they'll have flocks of juvenile sandhill cranes that have fledged from the parents, and they may hang out together for several years. But they all come together during migration and form survival groups in which they all cluster together for warmth, for protection, and to get as much foraging in as they can to help them rest and rejuvenate during their migration. A part of the social network that sandhill cranes have is that they dance, and they dance for a variety of reasons. They dance because they want to select a mate. They dance to thwart aggression. They dance to enhance their motor development and also to relieve tension. So there's a lot of reasons that sandhill cranes dance. And a beautiful thing about sandhill cranes dancing is that when they're attracting a mate and the two accept one another, they perform a synchronous dance. So they start a dance and dance together, and then it culminates with that synchronicity. We're going to hopefully watch a little video here of a pair of sandhills. All right. So there was a bit of dancing. Looked like fun. So once the Sandhills accept their mate, they will mate for life. If something should happen to their mate, they might accept another, but it generally depends on how long the mated pair had been together. So the loss of a mate can be tragic for a crane as well. The males in the species of sandhills are slightly larger than the females. However, this is opposite in birds of prey or raptors like the bald eagle and the great horned owl, for instance. They display what's called dimorphism, in which the females are actually larger than the males. But in our instance here with the cranes, the guys are bigger than the girls. The sandhills will preen themselves with mud into their feathers. One, because it maybe attracts their mate a little more to them, but two, for sure, it helps them blend into their environment just a little bit better, so it heightens their camouflage. And down here, the last two bullets I have are just, again, expanding upon why cranes dance. And they'll do this all year long, so it's not something they just do during mating season. They do it all year long because it's part of their social network. When sandhills decide to nest, they will build a nest, sort of a little tiny raised bushy platform, sticks, corn stalks, really whatever they can find in their local environment to just make a small rise up. It's not quite even a nest, but they will not nest on dry land, or at least not very often. Both the adults will build the nest, and if it's the same site which they return to in a former breeding year, so their breeding grounds, they may even reuse the same nest and just kind of refresh it. Usually, sandhill cranes have one brood per year with 1 to 2 eggs. Both the parents will take turns incubating the eggs. This takes about 30 days, and so the chicks will hatch sometime in early April, maybe to through the end of May. This is amazing. When the chicks hatch, they can leave the nest within 2 hours and are capable of swimming. I know that ducks probably exhibit this same trait, but I just find it fascinating that these little birds just born already have the ability to inherently know how to swim. These chicks, while they're young, will remain with the parents for about 10 months. But when these colts or young sandhills, they're called colts when they're juveniles, they must first learn how to forage for food and also follow the migratory routes of their parents. So that's why it's important that they stay with their parents through at least one migration in order for them to know how to migrate. Otherwise, if they didn't model their parents' behavior or the other adults, they would not migrate. Once the juveniles leave the adults and form their subadult flocks, they will remain with them anywhere between 2 to 7 years. And that just depends on the individual bird. One might find a mate at 2 years, one might not have a mate until 7 years. This is sort of the icing on the cake here is the top of this program. I know this has been a rather short, informal program, but I think we've been able to pack a lot of information into a short period of time. My favorite part of presenting are vocalizations. And so hopefully tonight, and I'm confident that we'll be able to hear the sandhills this evening. But their communication is such a deep, low rattling down into their chest. And the reason they're capable of making such low pitches is because their windpipe actually curls down and around into their sternum. So that sound really is deeper in tone. Both the male and female have the same rattling vocalization. And interesting, for every one time the male calls, the female calls twice. And calls may vary in length and loudness depending on what's going on. Are they reaffirming their relationship? Are they trying to contact their young? Is there a predator nearby? So their calls vary on what is the intent of what is happening in their environment. They have different vocalizations. Again, we just talked about a few of those. Mating calls, which we heard in the video clip there. It was kind of low, so you might not have been able to hear them very well, but it's a call of attraction. You're trying to attract that mate. There are contact calls between mated pairs, and basically they croon or purr into one another's fur, or not, excuse me, not fur. They wouldn't fly if they had fur. They have feathers, so it's definitely feathers. Unison calls, where the pairs will jointly croon or jointly call. And then there are guard calls, which are for alert or danger, which we mentioned on the previous slide. But of these three, we're going to hear a general rattle call, which is what I would call just their normal vocalization, their hey everyday talk, and then a unison call between a mated pair. And then finally, there'll be a flock call where you'll hear multitudes of sandhills uh, crooning at the same time. Let's play that one more time. All right, we played that twice for those of you who didn't hear it. One moment, please. There we go. There we go. Sorry about that. Again, with the technology, I have a new microphone tonight, which I thought might enhance my ability to project sounds and vocalizations. So, unfortunately, again, we will have another addendum to the program when we post the Sandhill Cranes after the conclusion of tonight's program. We will add an addendum with the vocalizations along with the video that we saw this evening to be added to that. What can we do? We know that our Sandhill Cranes are under federal protection, and there are things we can do, such as our conservation efforts we're going to briefly mention here. We need to continue to have protected areas, both at the federal and state level, whether they're refuges or preservations or different fish and wildlife habitats for the Sandhill Cranes. Performing surveys or censuses is basically when you go monitor the crane population and you count individual birds. The International Crane Foundation does do this, and they rely on what I like to call citizen scientists. They're volunteers from the community that you can be any age and any ability. And in the state of Indiana, throughout the Midwest, there's what's called the Midwest Crane Count, and this happens in April. So citizen scientists or volunteers from the community, whether you're in kindergarten, whether you're a retired school teacher, whether you're just someone interested in cranes, you can join in this effort to monitor crane populations so that we can maintain a healthy population of cranes. And then, of course, there's always public education programs such as this one. For more information on the Sandhill Crane, you can go to the International Crane Foundation website at savingcranes.org. You can also visit the Indiana Department of Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Division at in.gov/DNR. Or finally, there's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and you can just punch in the search there on their website for Sandhill Cranes, and it'll bring you up some wonderful information on these fabulous birds. So without any further ado, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in this evening. I hope that you had maybe a little bit of fun and learned a little bit about sandhills, and we will look forward to the next program that we will bring you, and that is yet to be determined, the topic, but it will be nature oriented. And as always, I encourage you with questions or comments, or perhaps a subject or a topic of interest in nature that you'd like to know more about, or have a potential presentation put on, you please email us at ask@cdpl.lib.in.us and put in the subject line cranes or something, sandhills or something of that nature. And that way we'll be sure that your emails will be forwarded directly to me, and then I can answer each of you personally. I really look forward to comments, questions, or suggestions that our audience might have this evening. Again, thank you, and we'll see you at the next nature program. Good night.